Good morning, Wild Goose. Thank you so much. This is the last day and I've lost my voice. I started losing it on the first day, so that's no big deal. But we'll try to eke out what we need to accomplish today. I'm glad to see so many folk. I got some fabulous folk over here. I'm loving it. And some wonderful people. Sister got her hat on. She's ready for the sun when it comes. I love it. It's good to see you this morning, raising the coffee cups and such. So we've been here this is our third day on main stage here having this conversation. And this is the conversation that more directly, more explicitly than all the others kind of traces the arc of our theme of living liberation. We started with a conversation about if we're going to live liberation, if we're going to step into beloved community, the first thing we need to understand is what is community. And so on the first day, our featured presenter was Ruth Padilla DeBoist, and she shared with us she's a theologian, narrative theologian, and she shared with us her thoughts, her meditations on community. And then she responded in conversation with one of her fellow theologians and with the audience. Our second day, we asked the question, what does economics and politics have to do with this reshaping of community, right? Because if we're going to reshape community, if we're going to step into beloved community, then some structures need to change. And so we heard from the theologian, theologian Joerg Rieger, and he shared with us his thoughts on economics and politics and class and what those things have to say. Job, labor have to say, how they need to be a part of our analysis. And finally, today we're asking a question around what do our various identities say about the way we shape community? Right? Because the new community, the beloved community, has to be a place that embraces people who haven't been embraced traditionally, historically. And so our featured theologian this morning is, Lisa Anderson. And you can find her information on page 19 of your book. But the one thing she asked me to make sure I shared with you is that she is founding director of the Sojourner Truth Leadership Circle, which aligns the creation of sustainable models of activist leadership with the emphasis on self and community care for social justice in the 21st century. She is the head of women's studies at Auburn Seminary in New York, and she will correct that title when she gets a chance to speak. And we are so delighted to have her here and as a part of this conversation. She had a few plane delays, but she finally made it, and we are glad for that. Please help me welcome and make feel welcome Lisa Anderson this morning.
Hey. All right, I'm excited, I have to say. Okay. So good morning, good people of God. Good morning. Yes, I love that. So I am so humbled and so honored to be here this morning with you all. This is my very first time at the Wild Goose Festival. And as a first timer, I would have been grateful enough to stand on this stage and offer my reflections on any number of theological topics with you all, because theology is not just what I do for a living. Theology, being a Christian theologian, is who I am at the core of my being, okay? It is not a professional identity I inhabit. It is not a position that I hold in the world because I have a lot of advanced degrees to justify what I say about God or church or the doctrines of the tradition. I mean, some of that really is true, and every bit of that is totally beside the point. What is the point for me is that it is God that first called me to this life of public theological reflection when I was a little girl growing up in Camden, New Jersey. And it is God who continues to sustain me in it. And so because of this first and this really foundational truth, at the drop of a hat, I am willing to engage in some serious God talk with any serious justice-loving people there are out there in the world. But this particular topic that we've been grappling with over the course of the last 3 days is especially meaningful for me. And so I just love that I get a chance to reflect with you in public about the connection between liberation, identity, and the formation of beloved community. Because you see, as a Black queer woman who spent the first 18 years of my life growing up in a city like Camden, New Jersey, which for anybody who knows anything about it, it has held this dubious distinction of being ranked one of the poorest and most crime-ridden cities in the United States. My so-called marginalized identity was supposed to guarantee me about 4 things: a life of poverty, a lack of educational opportunity, a perpetual battle with self-esteem, and a crappy job. But what it was not supposed to even allow me to imagine, let alone embrace, was that there might be something blessed and beautiful and something beloved about my embodiment. And yet, by the time I was 8 years old, God had already began to sing a new song in my ear. And it was a liberation song. And this is what the song goes like. It went like that then, and it goes like that now. You are my beloved daughter, in whom I am well pleased. Your name is Lisa. You will not pass through this life unheard or unloved. Instead, I will always cause you to remember that I exhale my belovedness onto you in all of your Black queer splendor, as I do to everything that I have made. And because I have caused you to know this, I call you to dedicate your life to proclaim the very same to every creature that I put in your path. Now, I want to stop for just a moment and acknowledge that what I'm offering to you right now is more of a testimony than a traditional theological reflection. I realize that it's purposeful, it's intentional. I realize that what I'm doing is sharing with you a part of the intimacy of my relationship with God and how that intimacy is linked to the historical communities and peoples that make me who I am. But when Ruth and Joerg and I met to discuss how I would engage our time together so as not to repeat or to duplicate one another, I immediately realized that my job was not to provide some heady theological intersectional analysis on why the formation of beloved community requires us to create inclusive relationships and ways of being together. I mean, I definitely know that we have to do that kind of work, and I'm dedicated to doing that kind of work, but honestly, do we really have to talk about things like that? Even when I utter phrases like bond around the intersectional reality of building relationships together, those kind of sentences make me tired, and they make me feel joyless. I'm tired of progressive Christian articulations that major in deconstructive analysis of systems and the interrogation of theological categories, but that leave the more tender and the more vulnerable conversations about how the Spirit doesn't just animate our work in a general way, but about how the Spirit touches us very particularly. I'm tired of that way of being theologically rigorous because it leaves me cold and it just leaves me out. I came to Christianity in a somewhat unlikely way, given who I am. The liberation song I first heard in Camden, New Jersey came to me via the airwaves of a conservative Christian radio station. It was called WKDN, the Sound of New Life. And to give you a sense of how conservative this station was, Harold Camping, remember Harold Camping? Millennial, the world is coming to an end, Harold Camping. Harold Camping broadcast on that station. I used to listen to it and him on this little white portable transistor radio while I was held up in my bedroom. I used to lock myself away in that room because I just didn't feel right in my flesh. Besides being black and queer, I also have a physical disability. And I was just so sure that because of all of these identities, that this pile of me was unworthy. And yet, behind those closed doors, God sang to me. God breathed on me. And God did so through messengers that I would later critique as being too privatized and as holding the dominant rhetoric of the Christian right. But for reasons that I can only attribute to the grace of God, my poor, black, queer, disabled self began to experience God as an aching, yearning presence that longed for me. God longed for me through those messages. Imagine that. Imagine a God so determined to liberate my identities that the principalities and powers of this world's racist, homophobic, misogynist, ableist, classic wickedness, that she would mount by any means necessary to call me out and to call me beloved through those messages. Man, sometimes I have to pinch myself. But what I learned from that experience and why I have decided to get intimate with you this morning rather than theoretical is because I know that I'm not alone. I know that my story is not unique. There is a whole world of us out there. And don't try to tell me that the church doesn't need us to be the church, because I know better. Now, I could continue on, let me tell you, in this vein for a long time, but I really want us to have a conversation more than I want to be the one that stands up here and talks and have you listen. So in closing, I want to pull out the essence of what I am trying to communicate to you in a way that y'all might be able to use. So I have distilled everything I've just said into what I'm calling the top 6 tips for the Christian intersectional organizer who longs to bring the Spirit in. So here it is. Number 1, don't be afraid to claim your testimony. It is the story of what God has done for you. It is the space where your liberation shines. And we progressive Christians need to tell these stories to each other and to the world, because the same God that liberates me liberates each and every one of you. God is one, and we are many in God's oneness. So sing your particular liberation song. Number 2, ground your identity in God, first, last, and always. And work for the kind of justice that makes space for every other creature of God to do the same. For me, this is the spirituality that must undergird intersectional engagement, organizing, and analysis. We need the God content, or else we die on the vine. Refuse to laundry list your personhood. One of the biggest struggles around identity-focused work for me is, paradoxically, it can feel objectifying and limiting. We can fall into this trap of reducing ourselves and our experience to this kind of check-off list that puts a chokehold on our imaginations. Don't do it. Don't run the list unless you are ready to tell a deeper truth. Number 4, invest in some folks that you can love, and then love them hard. Every day in my job at Auburn Seminary, I get to run a program that I created called the Sojourner Truth Leadership Circle. And get this, my job is to love black women for a living. Yes, imagine that. By helping them figure out how to love themselves and their communities, I get to create a context for them to hear and sing their liberation song. Don't tell me that that's not beloved community formation at the intersections. So I say, find your folks, even if they don't look like you, even if they don't sound like you, even if they don't speak your same language, even if you feel a little afraid of them at the beginning, find your folks and then fall in love with them. Number 5, be fiercely, fabulously, and unapologetically joyful. Or as Chris said in the queer theology panel last night, do you, boo. This is not a call to be Pollyanna, but a call to be passionately, prophetically authentic. Yesterday, the last question a woman in the audience asked about was about the nature of the spiritual practice that allows us to do the work. And let me tell you, I go to church sometimes, okay? I meditate even more than that. But what I really do is sweat. I am fierce in the gym. I feel myself there. I take up space. I am loud. And I tell you, there is power in that loudness. I feel alive, and this fuels my connection to God and my activism. So go get you some fabulous. And finally, number 6, embrace self-care as a mandate for prophetic witness. In other words, don't believe one of the biggest lies out there, namely that self-care is behavior unbefitting real activists. For didn't Jesus say, I came that you might have life and have it abundantly? And didn't Audre Lorde have his back 2,000 years later when she proclaimed self-care is an act of political revolution and resistance? Yeah. 2 people of color telling the truth and bringing a sense that what the formation of beloved community might mean for us all. That's what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Woo! So now we're going to invite Joerg Rieger up on stage, and I need to say, Lisa doesn't have a book out yet, but we need to start a writing campaign for all these publishers over here who have yet to learn who Lisa Anderson is. Same with Ruth, but Joerg does have a book or 2. Don't forget his flyers over in the bookstore. Joerg, please feel free, come up on stage. He's going to engage Lisa in conversation as we've done every morning, and then afterwards we will open up for a question and answer from the audience. So get your questions ready, and let's make sure we have a good mixture of people who are talking and speaking this morning. Joerg.
Thank you so much, Lisa. This was beautiful.
Oh, thank you. It was fun.
So as I said yesterday, my accent is not Texan, even though I spent my last 20 years in Dallas. But it's really from the South. I grew up and lived for the first half of my life in the south of Germany. And so south, and then I did my PhD in Durham, North Carolina, so great to be back in North Carolina. The reason why I say this, though, relates to what you said, Lisa. I grew up as a Methodist, which is very unusual in Germany. It's a very small church, has a lot of pietist traditions, maintains some of what John Wesley also stood for. But what was really important to us, I remember it as a kid, were testimonies. So the sort of thing that you're talking about this morning, that's how I was raised. I remember, in a small German town, lots of farmers, people talking about their own lives and stories about how a cow got healed miraculously and how that really saved that person's existence in a way. And so I think it's really important what you're talking about, namely that this strive for liberation is rooted in our own identities, in our own stories, which we then share. Yesterday I talked about this alternative Christianity, this alternative power, and I talked about people's traditions a few times. It seems to me that's exactly where these people traditions are rooted, in individual testimonies. So the people then are not the revolutionaries that only look at the structures and not at the individual. They have it all together already, indigenous folks, but also small German farmers and workers with whom I grew up, African American communities of whom you talked, queer communities and so on. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how this attitude of testimony, personal, individual experience of liberation might bring us all closer together.
Well, I think it's so funny. Two things came to my mind when you were talking about this. One, of course, that testimony tradition sort of lives in the DNA of Black folks. And even though grew up in an Episcopal church, which there's no testimonies, there's no testifying in Episcopal churches. We all know that. It's like a kind of a different kind of orientation. It's sort of like when people didn't have the resources of, like I'm thinking of even like pre-slavery, in the slavery traditions, when there weren't the written word that they could refer to, but there was their story that sort of sustained them through this this time of trial, when they didn't even know when the deliverance came from. It's almost like you rewrite, like there's more than one canon out there. That there's the canon that is the traditional canon, but then it reminds me of womanist theologians like Haiti canon, who talk about that unwritten canon that kind of binds us together in liberation communities. And I think what's really important about like those different canons is that when we're doing our intersectional work, if we create larger spaces for those, then our idea of what's sacred, that we are sacred, that texts are sacred, that, we expand that. I don't know if I'm answering that question, but another thing that was really interesting was that, so I like doctrinal theology a lot, and one of the things that inspired me to be in this testimony mode, as well as African American communities, is my reading of St. Augustine, of all people. And it's because, I've read Confessions about 30 times, it has to be said. And there's a conversation about intimacy there, and I could get all into the theological parts about the Neoplatonism and all that stuff there, but what really you see there is there's this yearning for God, there's this intimacy there, and that testifying that we do now, that I'm doing now as a Black queer woman, is linked to the very beginning of our tradition. It's not a new phenomenon, it's an old phenomenon. So that I can even say that that liberation, I can see liberation going back to, you said yesterday, the early Christian traditions, but even in those unlikely places like the church fathers.
I think that's the great news, that this is actually not just us thinking about it this way, but it goes back in history, it goes around the world, it ties the communities together in a very deep way. So I remember when my kids were little, one of my daughters had studied Egypt, ancient Egypt, Egyptians, and we always take these walks in the evening, and she walked next to me and she said, I have a question for you, Dad. 8-year-old, 9-year-old kid. She said, I studied now about oral traditions, and if I understand it right, these Jewish and these Christian traditions are also based on oral traditions, right? This is where you're coming from. These are all oral traditions. And then she said, what I want to know is, then how is any of this true? And we had a very long conversation about maybe it's exactly the other way from what we usually think. So truth is not what comes to you from the top, someone up there, you know, perhaps you're paradigmatic white male who studied a lot and who has a lot of degrees. But maybe truth comes precisely from these oral people's traditions. And what makes you then know it's true is that it's shared by so many people. That so many of us, you know, we can meet here, we can have a conversation on the stage, even though the two of us have never really met in person. And still we know there's a truth to it.
And you know, and it expands this idea of truth outside of this modern framework, this scientific framework, that truth is aligned with these you know, empirical, you know, data that's verifiable. Rather, that truth becomes enfleshed in the body and in the story and in the creation that we have together. And yeah, it's not categorized. It's lived. And I think just when you expand the canon again of who gets to tell a story and who gets to claim some truth, then that's another way to sort of unseat that top-down hierarchical model of where truth is supposed to lie.
So here's the next thing then, what you just said, namely, this truth is lived truth. I think part of our problem, I say this as a systematic theologian, is that we understand truth as an idea, something that's in our heads, but we're now talking about truth as something that's actually practiced, that's on the ground. Those of you who are pastors out there, I know there are a few, I met some of you, you know how difficult we often feel it is that we're preaching something from the pulpit and either nobody listens or nobody puts this into practice. But I think that's exactly the problem. We think of truth as head knowledge, and we tell people something thinking that they would put it into practice. Yet if you start, or you're starting, Lisa, praxis is already included. So it's based in your experience, it's based in your real life, and you can see it in terms of what happens.
And it makes you look for truth, and it makes you look for God in like weird places or different places. I mean, I used really granular examples, but let me tell you, for, you know, like that gym example, that I sweat, therefore that I know I'm fabulous. I like that. It's sort of not I think, therefore I am. I sweat, therefore I know I'm fabulous. But anyway, that whole idea that you would get, that, you know, the reason that it was important for me to think about, so what are the 6 things, or what are some real things that come out of what I was trying to say, was that it's like you can look for your truth in the body of your knowledge and then realize that you're not alone in doing that. Yeah.
So this really brings me back to my own religious beginnings, you know, my own traditions. We talked about testimonials. What was really important in that context always, I mentioned this yesterday briefly, was, have you made a personal decision for Jesus Christ? So decision, the German word was Entscheidung. Decision was the one thing that you would hear almost every Sunday. You have to make this personal decision. So what I'm wondering about is, based on these experiences, based on your own identity, on living your faith, what would it look like now to talk about this decision again?
So, you know, I didn't actually think in terms of I made my personal decision for God. It's that God is deciding for us. So that's, to me, that's where the shift is. It's that God is yearning and God is pulling us in. That's where the queer theology comes in for me. That's where the queer theology meets the womanist Black theology, where that struggle around embodiments that are considered outside. It's not that you've got to get, like what was problematic and what I ended up, why, you know, that critique of that rhetoric that says you make your decision for Christ, you make your decision for Christ. Why that's always been a little problematic for me is that there's so many conditions placed around that decision making. You know, when you get it right, when you do this, when you do that, or once you do it, you get locked into this way that you're supposed to be, the way that's traditionally understood. And this then goes back to this ancient theology that I like, Augustine, when he was talking about that, you know, God is at the center. So God is pulling us. And sin to me is what makes it impossible, what gets in the way of the pull. And what gets in the way of the pull is not being black, is not being queer, is not being woman, is not being other, it's not our embodiment. It's like it gets back to the structural things that you talk about, these structures that are put up to categorize and put bodies in certain places so that there's almost like a pecking order for how you can get there. And so the people in power are right up at the front of the line and everybody else comes back. And then there's all this that you got to fix in order to get to where the front of the line is. But if God is the one that's pulling, and God is the one that's yearning, and God is the one that is desiring, that lets me ease into God in a different kind of way. And to say that people who are broken get to ease in, that you don't have to work in, that you're already there. And so our justice work is about pulling away the crap that makes it impossible for us to realize that we're already there.
Wow, yeah, this is powerful message, and I think really at the core of it all is not so much just what we do, but what God is doing, and God really making that decision and inviting us in, I think is at the very beginning. Now, if you look at God from that angle, though, you can also see that God chooses sides, as it were. You know, all the way back to the Exodus, God chooses the side of the slaves and says stop to Pharaoh, says stop to oppression. So in that sense, the next thing I'm wondering about is how do we take sides for ourselves? Now, what a lot of people don't understand, we've been talking a bit about liberation theology yesterday, is that liberation theology is not liberal theology. It sounds a lot alike. In Texan, you know, to say liberal liberation, it sounds very similar, but it isn't. One of the differences is, you know, for liberals, we have this idea that everybody always has to embrace everybody. For liberationists, we have a sense that maybe sometimes you really have to take sides, and you have to say stop to the forces of oppression. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not loving anymore, but maybe a form of love is also to make a decision against something. You can't have it every and all way. You have to stand where you are with your people, and then also, on the other hand, to say, this is what we're not about.
Right. Well, let me say that. Let me say this. You have to do that. There's a poem that I like by Joerg. It was interesting. We had a Bible study at work the other day at my seminary, and a staff Bible study, and the passage was about Jesus and love, the love passage, the hard love passage about loving those who hate you and despise you and use you. And I admitted that I struggled with that passage a little bit, and I contrasted it to a poem that I know by June Jordan, and she talks about loving those who love her with all of her might and hating those who hate her. And I don't think I'm there, but I do think that, and I don't think that when God says no to and calls us to resist oppression and oppressive structures and the oppressor, that the oppressor is the person. It's not the personhood. This is why we have to get away from the personal and the individual in our conception. The personhood of the so-called oppressor and is not what the hate, what the pushback is about. And so there's no body that oppression comes in. it's not a prefab package, right? You don't get to be, there's no category that says white, straight, heterosexual male, and you all fall into the oppressor category. I think that that's the same problem that you get when you get the personalized God, the only personal relationship with God is that everything becomes what the individual does. So, but I do always resist and have to say no to anything that would oppress my body and the bodies of those that I love and the bodies of any person in those structures. But it's a fine line. It's like a spiritual discipline. It's part of the practice of creating beloved community that every day we have to interrogate with the spirit and with our heart and with our soul what it means to stand up with all of our might against oppression, call out in truth and love. And because when we call people out in truth and love, the other thing that we do is we give them an opportunity to ease into the same God that we are knowing that gives us that vitality. So there's no body that's wrong, but there's injustice, and there's no yes to it.
I think this is really important, so thank you so much for those comments, Lisa. I want to go on to what you were saying about joy, and I think it's related to what we have just said. If you really want to embrace that joy, and this is such a great day now with the sun coming out, we can feel it a little better than last night, perhaps, just from the weather. But it may actually mean that you have to draw some boundaries with that kills your joy, that kind of keeps you down, that doesn't let you soar. And in some ways what we found with the labor movement, religion and labor, once you know what side you're on, the old labor song, what side are you on, what side are you on, then you can really become a lot more joyful. And the sort of things that you're doing then, even if it's a demonstration, is not a sour task, but it becomes a joyful event where you're truly becoming yourself and where you're becoming one with God.
Well, one of the things for me about how we hold on to our joy is that, I love the Jewish concept of the Shabbat table, which is mirrored for me in Black communities with the welcome table. It's like even when we're doing all the work that we're doing, I think you all said it yesterday. We're not going to change the whole the world. This is God's work because this is God's world, and God works and moves through us. But in this moment in time, when it's pleased God to put us here, how do we live love and justice? And so one of the ways that we do it is realizing that it doesn't stop with us. And when it doesn't stop with us and we're just being is in the places where we find our joy. And so you set that table. You set that welcome table where people can sit down and be, right? And so the welcome table is where you bring all this. Is why, okay, so the Shabbat model and the welcome table model, I always think, boy, I love Black folks and I love Jewish folks because we get the food right. And so...
and Southern Germans do too.
We get the food right. And so you set that beautiful table and you invite your folks there and you just be. And imagine if you set the just being table, but there's all kinds of others at the just being table. And all of a sudden you're looking across the just being table and I feel like you glimpse the kingdom of God or the reign of God. That's the thing. We don't have to create it, but we get these glimpses all the time. And the problem is that sometimes we think that our glimpse is the whole thing, but we only get a glimpse and then the shutter shuts. So I need your glimpse in order to know that there's still some vision out there. And I need your glimpse in order to know that when my eyes are shut, your eyes are open. But we get that when we're out there and we're doing the demonstrating, but the idea that sometimes we get it in just being. Augustine said that our perfect rest is our rest in God. And he said we don't get that on this side of Jordan. It'll be eventually. But the journey is about the rest. And so when we get that Sabbath and when we set that table and when we see our others at that table, we get some joy there. And we get the vision of what it is, and that's what keeps us working.
Let me add a quick comment about food, my little joke about Southern German food. I remember talking to some African American and Latino friends about food at some point, and we were talking about what kinds of parts of the pig we're all eating. Now, we're not vegetarian in these traditions necessarily, and it turns out we're all eating everything off the pig. And they said, but you're German, you know, why are you eating, you know, pigs' snouts and ears and tails and all that stuff? Well, this is what the people do. I mean, you know, Germans are not all upper class, privileged people either. A lot of us are working people and, you know, come from these traditions. And so the real question then is, you know, as we embrace who we are as the people, as we embrace our people's traditions, our ancestors' traditions. One of my great-grandmothers, I remember as a kid, was a peasant who lived basically on a farm, and the assumption was that she lived there as the property of the owner, never to get married until the day she died. And she tells stories about how she sometimes stole bread from the kitchen because she didn't have enough. Those stories, when I entered theology as a field in the academic study, were supposed to be passé. That's the old stories. This is the stuff that you have to grow out of. You have to forget the language of your grandmother, the dialect of your great-grandmother. You have now to talk High German. So for me, the real thing here is not simply to embrace our people's traditions again and not to be ashamed of them, but now also to talk theology based on that. So where is God? When we say God, very quickly the gaze goes up to heaven. And with it goes up to the skyscrapers, the tall steeples, assuming that the one who has the corner office at the very top floor is much more like God than my great-grandmother. Now, again, for liberals, it may be easy to say it could be everything. Now, I love liberals, don't get me wrong. I mean, it's not a feud here, but I'm simply saying we have to take a little more step here. So maybe it's an either or. Maybe God is not at the top. God is not the CEO, the boss man. God is not the typical white male that we are usually envisioning when we talk about oppression. God is not your CEO type pastor or your great, 16-book published theologian. So I'm not God either, ultimately. Hard for me to say, but that's where we're going. God is ultimately there with the people. And could you say a little bit about what it really means for you embracing that insight?
So one of the biggest, most wonderful joys is that I'm not God. And so yes, and to like rest in the not being God, but as much as I have this deep sense of the intimacy of God, there's no image. It's become almost no image. I remember at the end of The Color Purple, I think it was, Alice Walker talks about an it almost. And she's talking, I think she's trying to render something that's less our possession, but that is known more in our making wholeness and right relationship. And so I don't have to, it's almost like I don't have to, God is not that CEO. It's like, it's just not. And it's more. But what I'm clear about is that we only get that glimpse when we love each other well and hard. That's all I know. And so it's just one moment where I feel like there's almost a silence when you come up to, so what is God? You know?
That's beautiful. Thank you.
It's been so rich. I'm loath to kind of change directions a little bit, but we want to give the audience a chance to get in on the conversation. So whomever would like to be the first.
Hi, thank you so much for your exchange. It has been lovely. And I'm Leanne Washington. I've self-published a little essay, and over your conversation reflects one little paragraph. And if you'll let me read it. Your last question is, what is God? One of the prominent messages of the Christian scriptures is that God is spirit. So, no white man, right? And that God's spirit dwells within us. We are told that no one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is perfected in us. Women. Okay, I'll stop. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were trying to get me to stop. All right. So, that God's spirit dwells within us. We are told that no one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is perfected in us. By this we know that we abide in him and he in us. And you all are talking about the connection, right? The Bible gives us the image of ourselves as a temple for God's Spirit. Do you not know that you are God's temple? And that bit of spirit that resides in us is also God's connection to us, as it is written. God yearns jealously for the spirit that he has made to dwell in us. Right? So we are all connected by that little spark of spirit in us. And Lisa, particularly you, the language that you've used, you said yearning twice today and talking about that. I just wanted to share that. So I thought.
Thank you. I love that.
Wonderful. Does anyone else, or would anyone else like to pose a question, make a comment? Yes.
This is a question for both of you. Okay, there we go. This is a question for both of you. Some people say that everyone is a theologian in some way. Some people say that theology is union with God in prayer when it's done right. And some people say that you ought to be having this conversation or be using these words or talking about this language over here. You know, if you're on the stage of theology, if you're like on the place that it's like actually happening. But I guess my question for you is become two-part, I guess. The first part is, what is theology, both of you? And then also, what is the role of theologians among the people of God, among the world? So that's my question.
Okay, so I mean, one of the reasons that I said at the beginning, where I made that comment about being born a theologian, and that it's like my deepest calling, gets to your question, because I mean, yes, hopefully, God, I will have a PhD next year, and and you know, I have a lot of theological degrees, but I actually don't believe. So I think of theology as it's God talk, right? That's the definition that I got from Rosemary Ruther when I first came into seminary was, you know, that it's God's talk and God speaking to the community, and the community sort of lifting up that talk, and so it's this provisional conversation, meaning it has to grow and change and shape with the communities that engage it. So when I take that into account, and then I remember, was it SunAM who said that faith, it's like theology is like faith that seeks understanding. And so in that sense, it can't be the property of the academy, because just those simple definitions start to break that apart. Because if you're all of our faith seeks understanding. And I think in this kind of conversation that we're talking about, the understanding that it's seeking, it's been limited when only certain bodies get to show up at the table to bring their knowledge and to bring their faith to make that understanding. And so when you open the space up wider, it means that we need more people to be engaged in more stories. And so it's not the province of the Academy, and there aren't any particular words. It's also the fact that I believe that theology, it's not science, right? It's not social science. It's not science. It's art. And it needs and it's co-creative. It's a part of how we are created in the image of God, which means that we're supposed to be creating. And theology is that paintbrush or that poetry that is our lives. And so everybody has access.
I spent the past 30 years of my life consecutively in the Academy, so I hope that some of it was actually worthwhile and is making a difference. So I have some sympathy for not just theology, but really academic theology as well. One basic definition that I use is theology is the self-critical reflection on the Christian life. A common definition is people say theology is the critical reflection on faith. I say it's self-critical. We are part of the critique. It's not just we're pointing fingers at other stuff, but we're beginning to understand how we are part of theology, how we're part of the theological problem, and how we're also part of the solution. So in that sense, self-critique is really important. And it's not just about doctrines. It's not just about thinking about the Bible, creeds and so on. It's also thinking about praxis, the Christian life as a whole. I'll give you a very clear example of what's on my mind related to what I just said about this question about God. My own German background knows of a time between 1933 and 1945 when it was very easily claimed that God is here, God is on this side. German fascism claimed God on its side. My grandfather, one of them fought in World War II, on the German side, mind you, had a belt buckle that read, Gott mit uns, God with us. So there's some theology here, but obviously I don't believe it. I do not believe that God was on the side of my own German grandfather going into war east against the Russians. So then this is where you need some theology. It's not just a matter of how do you feel about that, do you like it or not. Of course we have that again today, God bless America means God rubber stamp whatever we're doing. There you really need some deep theology because that gets you into trouble. On the other hand, I want to be claiming that God is here today, that the Spirit is moving among us. So how do I do that without falling into the old trap that God then gets used for the most powerful purposes? And so this is the reversal, this is the self-critical part. If you really want to proclaim that God is there walking with us, walking with the people, you need to do some very, very hard and excruciating theological work. I explain to my dad a lot, who is not an academic, that very often I sweat at my desk because the work is so hard. And it's so painful in many ways. But I really think we need this for the guidance. And this is the reason why I wrote all these books around, over the years, which is also a bit aggravating that they have none of them at the book tent here. None of the 16 books is here at the book tent. But there are a few flyers. Little self-promotion here. But what this is really about is that theology, whether it's an art, whether we can talk about it as a science of some kind, is really the matter of life and death, because a lot of theology has killed.
Yes.
We need to say this. A lot of theology has actually killed, and we are after what is life-giving. That's why we're here. And I think God is here with us in this case.
Amen. We have time for perhaps one more question, comment, concern. Yes.
Good morning. Good morning. one of the things before I went to seminary, a really good friend of mine said, all right, so seminary is going to try and think all the spirituality out of you, so just be ready. And I'm really glad he told me that, because it was, 11 hours of classes before we actually said prayer. So I'm asking about this binary, this distinction between head, right, and heart, and that since we know that theology is exploration of God and the divine, how do we help either those of us in seminary or those of us who are recovering from seminary or don't even want to go to seminary or just are loving God and loving God in our faith, in our churches, in our wherever, in our communities? What would you tell us about staying connected to spirituality within theology?
That's an interesting question, because when I went to seminary, I feel like I'm so lucky, because when I went to seminary, I didn't go. I went because I wanted to, right? For me personally, I've not ever had the disconnection. I actually get excited by the theological exploration, and it feels like spiritual. It is a spiritual experience for me. I know that some people have experienced it as deflating, but I don't know how to answer that question. I don't think anybody's ever asked me that question before, because I'd love to hear what you think, Joerg, and then maybe we can riff off of each other a little bit with that.
It's a question I've heard quite a bit, so thanks for raising it, and living within the seminary context for such a long time. I'm constantly wrestling with it. When I first started teaching in Dallas, that was 20 years ago, I started every class with a prayer. So for me, that was a natural thing. But what I'm doing now is sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. And the reason for that is that when I started with the prayer, I had a feeling that some students felt this was just another glorified Sunday school class, and they didn't take the hard work of theology seriously. They just wanted their spirituality. They didn't want any questions. Oh, this is how I feel. I want to just go on the way I am, and not have anything to do, with this theology stuff. So in this sense, what I'm wondering about is, how do you bring the two together? This is my own struggle, personally too. My own life, not just for my students. And I can tell you, if you really get into this theological work, Lisa started us off in the morning early, talking about some of the problems with this deconstructive spirit. There's a sort of negativity sometimes that's not helpful. On the other hand, there's also a sort of deconstruction that might help you deepen your spirituality. And sometimes that's painful, because you have to give up stuff that you like, that's dear to your heart. But sometimes that's also what ultimately then makes you more profoundly spiritual. So it's this back and forth struggle that I'm finding. And so I wouldn't ever just give up theology or cut down on theology simply to preserve people's individual feelings of spirituality.
Yeah, I think I can say, I hear what you're saying. When I came into college, because I came to college and I majored in religion. And so I had a lot of the kind of seminary type courses when I was in college. And the first one that I had was Bible. And I was coming from this more traditional, almost fundamentalist perspective on how you read the Bible and how you engage spirituality. And then I had JD, all of that, biblical scholarship that taught that it wasn't the divine word of God. And I was rocked. like I really felt like, well, you're trying to take my Jesus away from me. And it was a long time before I realized, that there was a different thing. And one of the things was that the professor did pray in that class. And I think that the fact that he prayed was giving me an insight into the fact that, oh, you mean he believes something that's close to what I believe. So I think it had to do with we're responsible to bring our our spirituality in at the same time and not cut the head off from the heart.
One thing I really like about the Wild Goose is that I think we're doing some of that here. We're doing some of that hard theological work together with spirituality, and that's the challenge of the Christian life altogether. Theologians in some ways are professional theologians, but there is some truth to the fact that everybody is also a theologian, because people think, have questions, and those need to be taken seriously. So, yeah, it all comes together. Thank you.
Yep.
I guess
Thank
we're back
you
to Melvin.
so
right?
much. Thank you so much. Please give them a hand. Please give them a hand. This has been such a rich conversation, and you all have been so important in helping to flesh out this living liberation. I feel like as a result of the conversations we've had each morning, that we have something to take home with us, all right? And not just practical, something that'll stir in our hearts and in our minds for the next year. So thank you so much again. Another hand.